Lots to discuss right now with MS Now congressional reporter Michael Schnell in Kentucky, MS Now White House reporter Jake Traylor, the Boston Globe's Washington bureau chief Jackie Kucinich, and MS Now political contributor Greg Bluestein of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And Jake, I want to start with you. This president is clearly not a lame duck despite his very low approval ratings. What are we hearing from him about these key races?
Yeah, Anna, look, this is Trump's latest test of political clout, and he's got wind in his sails after that crushing defeat of Bill Cassidy over the weekend. Speaking with White House officials right now, they're telling me that as this exciting primary week takes place, there is one really keen area the president has his eyes attuned to, and that is Kentucky, the race with Representative Thomas Massie, someone who, as you said, has opposed the president on the war with Iran, on the release of the Epstein files, and has bucked up against Trump in multiple ways throughout his tenure. And the latest attack from the president on Massie came just moments ago if we're talking about trying to understand where Trump's focus is right now. I want to read that Truth Social post that Trump just posted where he said that Massie was the worst congressman in the long and storied history of the Republican Party. He goes on to say that he's an obstructionist and a fool. Vote him out of office tomorrow. Anna, I was just speaking with a White House official who's really keenly attuned to the midterm strategy for the White House. And they said that the president is very satisfied and focused on essentially eliminating any person who butts up against him within his own Republican Party. That can't be made more illustrated by the fact that the president is sending, in a really unprecedented tone, his Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, to Kentucky to campaign on behalf of Massie's opponent that the president has endorsed. This also comes, too, against really notable polling that shows the president may have that vice grip on the Republican Party, but he's losing it with a lot of moderates and folks in America as the war with Iran continues. I just want to take through quickly some of this polling that the president is facing. New York Times polling showing that Trump has a 37% approval rating, a 33% approval rating on the economy, cost of living 28% approve. There's also new CBS polling that came out just a couple of days ago showing a 27% approval rating, and amongst Republicans, only 63% approval on handling of inflation. So the White House right now, as I talk with officials, they're really working to square the fact that the president may have this grip on the Republican Party, and heading into these primaries, we've seen that in Illinois, now Louisiana. We'll get that test in Kentucky tomorrow. But when it comes to the war in Iran and the way that Americans are feeling overall, the president and the White House are struggling to square that circle, Anna.
Interesting. Thank you, Jake Traylor. And Michael, we just heard from the Pentagon about Secretary Hegseth's unconventional visit today in Kentucky. What's the Pentagon saying?
Yeah, Anna, unconventional is the key word here, and it's for a number of reasons. I mean, first off, the fact that we're seeing so much interest in a House GOP primary in a ruby red state, in a ruby red district, is unconventional in and of itself. Of course, President Trump has put this race on the map, going after Thomas Massie, endorsing Ed Gallrein, and so that's why we're seeing so much interest. To that point, seeing such a heavyweight like the defense secretary come to this district and campaign is also unconventional within and of itself. And then the context here is key. The fact that the Iran war is still raging. President Trump has been looking for an off-ramp and a solution here, and he hasn't been able to find it. So with all that being said, we will see Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth here in the hotel right behind me with Ed Gallrein just this afternoon during a campaign event. The Pentagon is saying that this is all above board, noting that this trip is not being paid for by taxpayer dollars. I'll read to you some of what the Pentagon spokesperson said in a statement, quote, Secretary Hegseth is attending this event in his personal capacity. No taxpayer dollars will be used to facilitate his visit. His participation has been thoroughly vetted and does not violate the Hatch Act or any other applicable federal statute. The Hatch Act there that's being referred to is a law on the books that says federal employees can't participate in most political activities. So the Pentagon right there saying that this is, again, all above board. We're going to have to see what this event entails and what is said later today. The question, though, is key of whether or not this will move the needle among these Republican primary voters here in Kentucky's 4th congressional district. As Jake noted to, one of the key points of contention that President Trump has with Thomas Massie is the fact that Massie has so harshly criticized the war in Iran. He spearheaded war powers resolutions to try to bring the conflict to an end. So perhaps having the defense secretary here and a candidate who is a Navy SEAL leaning into the war in Iran and talking about it, we'll have to see if it moves the needle at all with these primary voters. But when you try to find differences between Massie and Gallrein, that's certainly one of them.
Michael Schnell in a windy Kentucky today. Thank you for laying the groundwork there, and keep us posted as we anticipate the defense secretary's visit there. So, Jackie, Massey's race tomorrow is just the latest stop now in the president's political revenge tour. And I want to play a portion of Senator Cassidy's concession speech in Louisiana this weekend after he was knocked out of the primary there.
When you participate in democracy, sometimes it doesn't turn out the way you want it to. But you don't pout, you don't whine, you don't claim that the election was stolen. Let me just set the record straight. Our country is not about one individual. And if someone doesn't understand that and attempts to control others through using the levers of power, they're about serving themselves. They're not about serving us.
Jackie, does Cassidy's loss send a warning sign to other Republicans who might go against the president?
I just have to note that is probably more forceful than Cassidy has been since Trump was reelected towards the president, even though he didn't say his name. He has been just acquiescent to most of President Trump's requests, and just couldn't have tried to be more in favor. Now, Trump was never going to get over the fact that he voted to impeach him, but to hear that now, when in fact he no longer has anything to lose, is just an interesting thing to note. Certainly, it depends on where you are in terms of if you're able to say no to the president. And right now, we're seeing Thomas Massie in that position as we speak. Particularly, he's being $32 million, just the most expensive House race in history at this point. And it's also a referendum on Massie himself. When you hear from voters in Kentucky that some of them are questioning Massie's approach to saying no to absolutely everything and whether or not he's able to get something done by doing that. Now, Massie's a libertarian. He's someone who explains that someone has to say no in order for discussion to be had. However, this is a test for him. Now, the last time Trump came at him, he won by he had 81% of the vote in the primary. We'll have to see what happens tomorrow.
And meantime, in Georgia, Greg, there's a three-way Republican race to challenge Democratic Senator Jon Ossoff, but the president has not endorsed a candidate in this race. Why is that? And is this still considered one of the best chances for Republicans to try to flip a Senate seat?
Yeah, it's unique because it's both, right? Jon Ossoff is at once one of the most vulnerable Democratic incumbents because he's the only Democratic incumbent running for re-election in a state that Donald Trump won, but also he's built up a huge war chest. He's shown a proven appeal to not just consolidate his party's base, but also reach out to middle-of-the-road voters who will end up most likely deciding this race. And on the Republican side, you don't have an anti-MAGA strain here, right? The AJC's last poll just a few weeks ago showed that likely Republican voters, about more than 85% or so of them approve of Donald Trump's record. So all three of these Republican contenders, they're all running as pro-Trump candidates, just to varying degrees, right? Buddy Carter, Mike Collins, the two incumbent congressmen, they're calling themselves MAGA warriors. Derek Dooley, he's the former football coach who's backed by Governor Brian Kemp. He's also saying he will further Trump's agenda, but he says it takes an outsider like Donald Trump to beat Jon Ossoff. So you're seeing a very much of an embrace, a tight embrace of the president, but also a recognition that you need someone else in order to beat Ossoff.
And Greg, Georgia is also looking to fill 2 spots on that state Supreme Court, right? How much focus is on those races with the state about to consider new election maps as we continue our coverage of all the redistricting moves around the country?
Yeah, this is an incredible race because it's officially nonpartisan. It's a judicial race. It's decided tomorrow. So tomorrow is tomorrow is the vote. And for a long time, these races have been sleepy. Not since 1922 has an incumbent Supreme Court justice lost a re-election bid. So that gives you a little bit of the history of these races. But 2 challengers, Jen Jordan and Miracle Rankin, they're both running as full-on liberal left-leaning challengers backed by the Democratic Party of Georgia, which could put Georgia on different footing going forward. These races, I think, are about to be a lot more partisan going ahead.
Jackie, Jake touched on the president's vice grip over the party of Republicans, despite his nationwide net negatives on the economy, which, of course, was such a key issue that got him into the White House for the second term. Does it seem like MAGA loyalty is outweighing voters' concerns about gas prices and rising costs?
I don't know that it's outweighing them, but there's certainly Republican primary voters, which are the most loyal of Republicans, have happily reoriented themselves around the president, which is why he still is such a force. Now, what will that mean in a general election when you have independents in play there, which we know in the last election went to President Trump in many places? We'll have to see. But certainly it's getting harder and harder to differentiate what the Republican Party is and who Donald Trump is, because they are very much one and the same, particularly when you're talking about Republican primary voters.
Right. The primaries, too, are different when it comes to turnout, Greg. Of course, Georgia could see record turnout now, 5 years after Trump made that infamous phone call to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, asking him to find 11,780 votes. Raffensperger's now running for governor in Georgia. How heavily is Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 election playing in these Georgia races, and what does that mean for turnout?
Yeah, these 2020 races still loom over. I feel like not just the race for governor, but also races for U.S. Senate, races for down ticket contest, even that judicial contest we just mentioned, because the two challengers are framing themselves as the last line of defense for election protection efforts as well. But in the race for governor, it is looming largest because, as you mentioned, Brad Raffensperger, he's now a candidate. He's been about 15% most polls. He's in third place. His campaign says there's still an opening to get into a runoff in June. All the candidates are playing for a runoff because the two front runners, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones and billionaire Rick Jackson, have spent about $100 million so far just on their campaigns, record-setting in a Georgia midterm primary. We're overwhelmed with these ads, and a lot of voters are just exhausted, and they're certainly exhausted by talk of 2020 still looming over 2026.